Hi there, ethics students. This is Bill Eisenhart. I'm creating a video for the Kant material. So I think you're going to want a few things. You're going to want to take some notes. So pretend this is like a lecture. Um, you're going to want to print out the outline on the Kant material that I have posted, and I might email it to you guys as well. You want to have your book because I'm going to make some references to the textbook. And you're going to want to have the course pack. So if you want to hit pause to get those things ready. Okay, so I'm going to assume now we're back. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing okay. I'm going to try to limit this video to about 10 minutes so the video doesn't get too large. My plan is to create a second video to finish up the Kant material. So to start with, Immanuel Kant was an 18th century German philosopher. You don't have to know any of the background personal stuff about him. He was quite eccentric. If you want to read more about him, there's of course the book, and if you went to Wikipedia, that would also give you some background information about him. But anyway, lived in the 18th century, German philosopher. The big thing is that he is an example of a formalist. So unlike Mill and Bentham, who we've talked about as utilitarians, who think morality is a function of consequences, Kant didn't believe that at all. In fact, he was as extreme a formalist as you can get. He didn't think that the consequences of an action, things like maximizing happiness, had anything to do with morality. He's really clear about that. What makes him a formalist is he thinks that morality is characterized not by maximizing happiness, but by moral rules and principles. So formalists believe in the concept of moral rules and moral rights. Utilitarians, of course, didn't believe in moral rules at all because they think that theoretically any action, given the right circumstance, could lead to the greatest happiness, so they would never have a moral principle against it. But Kant, as a formalist, did think that morality is a function of following rules and principles. One of the big things with Kant is his emphasis on intent. Kant thought that moral intent was critical for deserving moral credit. He thought it wasn't just enough to do the right thing, you had to do the right thing with good intent. Not all formalists stress intent as much as he did. This is really a part of his philosophy that's pretty idiosyncratic to Kant himself. All formalists believe in moral rules, but they don't all follow intent the way that Kant did. If you look at the first sentence of the book, this is on page 145. This is the very first sentence from the quoted material. Kant says that nothing can possibly be conceived of in the world or out of it that can be called good without qualification except for a good will. So what Kant is saying there is that he thinks that a good will is the only thing that's intrinsically good. So unlike the utilitarians who thought it was happiness, Kant did not. In fact, if you look at that first section, he spends basically the entire time, and section 2 as well, explaining why nothing else can be thought of as being intrinsically good. He says things like intelligence, happiness, health, all of these things, moderation, being cool under pressure, none of these things are intrinsically good, because if the person who had those things was morally evil, it would actually allow them to do even more evil. So you think about, the classic example is Adolf Hitler, right? He must have had some charisma, he must have had some intelligence to be able to rise to power and carry out all the things he did. But of course, they only allowed him to make him worse because he was a terrible person. So for Kant, none of those things are intrinsically good. But as long as you act with a good will, it is certain that you will be deserving of moral credit. So the big question then is, what does it actually mean to have a good will? Well, it has nothing to do with attaining some purpose. It has nothing to do with consequences. He talks about that in section 2. Rather, to have a good will means to act solely out of duty to the moral law. So the question then is, what does Kant exactly mean by that? So he distinguishes it he distinguishes acting solely out of duty to the moral law from acting merely in accordance with it. Acting merely in accordance with the moral law means you did the right thing, but you don't really deserve moral credit. So if I dive into a river to save someone from drowning, that's a good thing. But if the reason I did it was to get a reward, then I don't deserve any moral credit for that. I'm not blameworthy. I did the right thing, but I don't deserve any moral credit because I didn't have a good will. To have a good will means I dive into the river to save the drowning person because I've got a moral obligation to save the person's life. If that's what's motivating my behavior, then I would deserve moral credit for it. So there's a rather famous example that Kant gives to illustrate what it means to act with a good will. And the example revolves around a candy store owner. So we've got this hypothetical candy store owner, opens up his business 9 o'clock in the morning or whatever, and nobody's around. No other workers, no customers. He just opened up his shop. And walking through the door comes a young child, 7, 8-year-old kid. And the kid wants to buy some candy. And the kid has, let's say, $20 with him. And he says to the candy store owner, I'd like to buy $20 worth of candy. Well, candy store number 1 looks around the room, sees there isn't anybody, realizes this kid has no idea how much $20 is worth. And so he gives the kid, let's say, a little fun size Snickers bar, right? One of these little 50-cent things. Have you ever noticed that fun size means really small? Anyway, so he gives the kid, let's say, 50 cents worth of candy, right, for the $20, and he rips the kid off. Well, clearly he's violating the moral law, so he clearly has not done the right thing, and he's morally blameworthy. Candy store owner number 2 realizes the kid has no idea how much $20 is worth, and is about to rip the kid off when he starts thinking about it. And he realizes that while the kid doesn't know what $20 is worth, he must have gotten the money from somewhere. A parent, uncle, grandfather, next door neighbor, somebody who does know the value of $20. So rather than rip the kid off because he's afraid people will find out, he gives the kid $20 worth of candy. So, something like this. Oh. Anyway, right. So he gives the kid $20 worth of candy for his $20. But the reason why he does it is that he's afraid people will find out. Word gets out, nobody will go to his candy store anymore. He'll have a bad rep in the neighborhood. So because of his business concerns, he doesn't rip the kid off. He gets no moral credit for Kant. He's acting in accordance with the moral law, meaning he did the right thing, but he did it for the wrong reasons. Candy store owner number 3 also doesn't rip the kid off. He gives the kid $20 worth of candy for his $20, but the reason why is because he realizes the moral law says you don't rip people off. You don't steal. And so he's acting solely out of duty to the moral law. So the next question for Kant is, okay, so if having a good will means you act out of duty to the moral law, what is the moral law? Well, the moral law, according to Kant, has to apply universally. It has to apply to all people at all times, because that's the nature of a law. If it had exceptions, it wouldn't be a law. So it has to be universal, and it has to be based on reason, because that's the only thing that's universal. It can't be based on emotions. It can't be based on religion. It can't be based on customs. It has to be based on only rationality and reason. And so the moral law has to apply to all people at all times. So the moral law will come in the form of what he calls a categorical imperative. A categorical imperative, an imperative is a sentence that tells us what we ought to do, like you should brush your teeth before you go to bed, or you should go to Chicago this weekend, hear some jazz, right? Those would be examples of imperatives. A categorical imperative is one that applies to all people all the time. So it'll be something like don't kill or don't steal. He distinguishes the categorical imperative from what he calls hypothetical imperatives, which only apply to some people at some times. The course pack has really good examples of hypothetical imperatives. If you have diabetes, then you should take insulin shots, which is good advice if you're a diabetic, but it doesn't apply to other people. So the moral law has to come in the form of a universal imperative. And Kant says there are 2 formulations of it. One is to only treat people as an ends and never as a means. So you don't just use people. So that's one formulation of the categorical imperative. The other one, which is more famous, says um, you should only act in such a way as can be raised to the level of what he calls a universal law. So for Kant, the categorical imperative is a two-step process. First step is you have to sort of identify or describe the action. Are you thinking of stealing or killing, lying, having dinner? What are you going to do? So you describe the action, and then in the second step, you ask yourself, can I imagine the action be made into a universal law? Because again, that's one of the things that characterizes morality. It has to apply universally. So if I'm thinking of killing my next door neighbor, remember, for the utilitarians, it might be justified to kill Fred I live next door to because he's really miserable and unhappy. Kant would say I should ask myself, can I imagine killing being a universal law? Well, I can't, because if everybody went around killing all the time, everybody'd be dead, and then there couldn't be any more killing. Well, maybe one person would be left. Arnold, right? Arnold's left. Saw, right, he's the only one. I guess he'd have to kill himself then, right? If killing was universal. Um, well, anyway, it can't be made into a universal law, so that tells us that killing is intrinsically wrong. So unlike the utilitarians who might think that killing could be morally justified if that led to the best consequences in the situation, Kant would have a moral principle against killing. It's never justified. Similarly with things like lying. You can't imagine lying being universal because then there'd be no such thing as the truth. He also says stealing can't be imagined to be universal because if everybody stole all the time, then no one would ever own anything. If there's no ownership, then there's no stealing. So he'd have a rule against that. Don't steal, don't cheat, don't lie. None of these things can be made into universal laws. And so he would have moral principles against them. All right, so I'm going to make another video continuing from this and talking about some of the criticisms and problems with Kant and any kind of formalist approach.